Dakota Proclamation by Meredith Quinn, Musa. Termination. The White Charger. I remember the day that I got on my white charger and went on a crusade into enemy territory, with truth as my ideology and with my little banner waving, with these words inscribed, "I'm going to help my people." I met the enemy on the open field, and war plans were discussed. Truth was for whatever purpose was needed, stark naked and a little hard to believe. After the first charge, picked myself off the ground, I had a new banner in my hand. It was black with these words inscribed, "Don't stand in the way of genocide." I turned back to watch the enemy reform for the second charge. I counted the knights and their banners. There was the Bureau of Indian Affairs, Department of the Interior, the Insular and Interior Committee, the Supreme Court, Congress of the United States, law enforcement agents on and near reservations, lawyers trying to make a name for themselves, business and oil interests with their surveyors and field agents who shot, driving Plymouths with blown Chryslers, Hemis who shot real bullets. What really brought fear to my heart was the army in back of the enemy. Thousands of the finest legal minds that can be retained, the biggest and finest computers, thousands of government employees, huge piles of millions of dollars, and urban Indians ready to run and tell the world, "I have been defeated." Uncle Tomahawks, soup bone Indians. Some are very easy to find. Just look for an Indian on a street corner with his briefcase shouting, "I'm the chief. I'm the spokesman for the Indian." I got off the white horse. There was only one of me, and I was going to have to fight them Indian style, hit and run. So I got into my Ford and warmed up my Cobra engine. I surprised everybody by attacking first, and my charger carried me past the enemy into the field of the army. I grabbed a few statistics and some files marked "Top Secret Indian Identity." Please excuse me. When you have attacked the enemy, outfoxed him for 6 years, and still live, you feel kind of cocky. This book was destined to be written because sooner or later, one mistake would reveal and lead to clues long sought by the world, even if it took almost 500 years to disclose the most closely guarded secret on what is really planned for the Indian on this hemisphere, such that unless world opinion became involved, the Indian would be put through a plan of genocide which would have exterminated him not only as a race, but as a nation and culture. What was this one mistake? Thou can think or hate, whichever you choose. No, it wasn't an Indian, but the Department of the Interior employees that began to believe their own propaganda on the Indian. There were two persons that created the key so the Indian could untangle the mess he is in. Not that it's going to be untangle, just provide the key. The first is the former Commissioner of Indian Affairs, Brophy, who is the author of the Indian American Unfinished Business. He did not write it in favor of the Indian, but by the information he placed in it, I believe he was hoping the Indian would pick it up. The other is former Secretary of the Interior, Stuart Udell, who tried so hard to get Congress to pass the Omnibus Bill, or Senate Bill 1816. There were 16 other bills. Any 3 would have made up the Omnibus Bill. This was a Termination Act that, had it ever passed, would have abolished every Indian and reservation in this country. The plight of the American Indian in this country, however hopeless it appears, does possess a key called termination. It is now a word that is very popular when the problems of the Indian are discussed. By no means is it new either in concept or in practice, because under the Spaniard it had its beginning, free from its actions, which were more open and direct, such as extermination, murder, and rape. The landing of the Pilgrims saw no change. They too quickly learned to practice it, a little more sophisticated than the Spaniards did. The concept presented to the masses was that the Indian was savage, ignorant, subnormal human, and that he stood in the way of progress. Upon this platform, they too picked up termination, extermination, rape, murder, intimidation, embezzlement, and swindling. I hope you don't believe this has stopped, because it hasn't. You only have to study the jurisdiction which HEW has over Indian health. Death for the Indian today is a little more sophisticated, carrying finer ideologies for its reasons, but it still works. The death rate of the Indian signals genocide every day of every year, yet it is an accepted fact of life that comes with being Indian. No, it hasn't changed since it started under the Spaniards. All the presidents of the United States from the beginning to the present day, with the exception of one, have rolled up their sleeves and put their hands in the bloodbath of the American Indian. The ones that believed in doing it up wholeheartedly were Thomas Jefferson, Andrew Jackson, whoever was the president under the General Allotment Act of 1887, Teddy Roosevelt, Dwight Eisenhower, Lyndon Johnson, Richard Nixon. It is my personal opinion that Richard Nixon will complete the job that has taken almost 500 years. It was under the Roosevelt administration that the American Indian had some rest from 1934 to 1941. For 7 short years, genocide stopped. His land shrinkage slowed down. He would participate in the affairs of his own people and his reservation, and had the right to question actions that involved his life, and the right to question how money was to be spent educating him and helping him to assimilate. He had the right to the running of his own reservation. This period was called the Indian Reorganization Act, or the Howard Weller Act of 1934. This act was not perfect, but it did give the Indian a chance to breathe. Maybe the greatest harm it did was that the Indian learned to trust the white man again. It later opened him up for exploitation. Termination, as far as it is understood and works on the Indian, is still the most acceptable means of genociding him, not only as a people, but as a race and nation. The Termination Acts under the General Allotment Act of 1887 and the House Concurrent Resolution 108 under the Eisenhower administration are great milestones of experience that the Indian himself knows means that he has to be exterminated. In 1961, the Secretary of the Interior's task force had a great number of recommendations calling for a shift away from termination. Yet, in 1967, something to Indians called the Omnibus Bill, or the Indian Resources Development Act, Senate Bill 1816, was probably the one piece of legislation that could have annihilated the Indian forever, if it had ever passed the Congress. In 1969, a report called The American Indian and the Bureau of Indian Affairs, prepared by Alvin M. Joseph, Jr., stated one of the major objectives of the Nixon administration, which plans to have a termination policy for the Indian. Like the Hoover Commission of 1949, it was the exact volume that Eisenhower needs for the great termination policy in the 1950s. What is termination? But what is termination? How can it be bad for the Indian if it helps to assimilate him into the mainstream of the American way? Look at all the money he will be paid. He'll be just like us, American, a major newspaper in Los Angeles early in 1969. The Bureau of Indian Affairs pulled a small string, and a spokesman for the National Congress of American Indians held a press conference stating that termination was a nasty word and that the Indian should progress. True. Termination is one of the keys to the Indian problem. But what is termination? Who started it? What does it mean? How does it work? First, there is no clear legal definition of this important act, which is something that every reservation Indian must face sooner or later. In early 1965, during my lectures on termination, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, urban Indians, and attorneys all called me a troublemaker, a communist, and a left-winged liberal. They said that I took my orders from Moscow. Yet today, whenever Indian problems are discussed, termination is the main and common subject. But in my personal sufferings, in which more blood has been spilled than most people have in their body, I have become an undisputed authority on the subject of termination. As I feel that I have the right to give this legal definition, which is coming from an Indian. Termination, Indian. Quote, an act that takes a particular Indian tribe with its treaty, its human rights, its lands, its culture, its language, and declares it non-existent. The Indian, who has no land ownership right, but does have an occupancy right, that must be extinguished before this act has any authority. There are 3 reasons for extinguishing this right of occupancy. 1. Voluntary, with the promise of money to be paid for this right. 2. Condemnation, for eminent domain purposes such as flood control, highways, roads, telephone lines, national defense, or a national park. 3. Industrialization, such as housing, factories, shopping centers, mines, airports, and their buildings. The Indian's occupancy right must be extinguished before any of these acts can take force. The Indian must sign it away. The best known practice is coercion. If coercion fails, the extreme physical act is used to relieve the problem. Land value for which compensation is to be paid to the Indian is determined by land value 100 years old, to hide the fact that the Indian has no land ownership rights. Compensation for lands all must be deposited with the Department of the Interior at current market value of lands. The Indian will receive only 11 cents to 47 cents per acre, which will go into some kind of trust fund, which it takes an act of Congress to be dispersed. This act does not relieve guardianship, alienation, or severalty, so no citizenship is issued to the Indian. The records of the culture, language, and physical genocide that occurred to this tribe are destroyed. The Indian legal problem remains the same, except he no longer has a reservation or treaty to keep total annihilation from closing in. End quote. This is the shortest definition that can be made of termination. It is an act that touches every law that governs the Indian, which ensures that his land control remains so that special interest groups can take portions as they need them. The public is led to believe that it is being done for the best interests of the Indian, so he can take his rightful place in society. The land you are standing on is a product of termination. But there was one mistake in the acts of termination. The Indian has never surrendered his land rights, only occupancy. This is still being held in trust with the federal government. So far in federal statutes, there is no act which calls for the Indian to surrender his land rights. But after all this, you still ask, what is termination? Ask any attorney at law, and he too will state that he has no knowledge of this act. Yet, if he follows this act through all of its legal steps, he will become a millionaire overnight, tax-free. Picture an attorney not knowing the one most profitable legal procedure in the world. It is practiced in every country of North and South America where there is an aboriginal land right, even in Mexico. Once you understand it, the blindfolded lady of justice has her eyes covered for only one reason, so that she won't see who rapes her, and so that she can't see the scales are empty. Here's another problem for the reservation Indian. The U.S. government gave voting rights to the Indian who no longer cares about the living on the reservation, so that he can vote against the rights and claims of his brother on the reservation. His vote can terminate an Indian reservation and still be thousands of miles away. He has given up the right to protect the sovereign Indian nation, to become part of urban life away from the problems. This Indian waiting for money to spend for only his personal expenses signs away everything the reservation Indian is fighting to keep, such as the California land claim, which is nothing more than termination of the land rights of the California Indians. He waits around Indian centers in the major cities to tell other Indians to sign the same way he has. He believes that a payment will be his if he cooperates with the BIA, and receive no promise that money will be paid. He takes the chance by signing everything away, just as a hope only, have nothing to lose. Why should they care? Well, tell them to study the Mexican-American problem, because they are fighting the same problem this same urban Indian who has just left the reservation is fighting. The problem is over 400 years old, so it hasn't changed. Remember, the Mexican-American grandparents of the Chicanos of today didn't care either. And look where they're at. What is termination? There is no clear definition, according to the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the Supreme Court, or the Indian himself. We do know it abolishes the tribe lands treaty and the sovereignty of the 102 tribes terminated between 1953 to 1960. We are still looking for lands, money, and Indians. There is no statute, law, or act that states that the Indian can own land as an Indian. In short, what termination does is provide an act for business to acquire Indian land legally. The complexity of termination, when it deals with the Indian, makes it impossible for a good termination to favor the Indian. There can be no good termination until the Indian understands his legal identity and his sovereign rights to his Indian nation, according to international law. His knowledge must make his sovereignty recognized by any nation in the world, not until his rights to health, education, welfare, and lands are returned to him. Then and only then can there be good termination. I'm against termination that gives no room in this society for him to cling to his culture. Even today, he faces new phrases, but the policies are the same. The interesting one has been made by a man sworn to protect the Indian lands and resources. The former Secretary of the Interior, Walter Hinkle, states, "The Indian uses the reservation for a crutch, and the white man as a cop-out." Yet he turned around and leased the north slope of Alaska to everyone but an Indian. It is such statements as these that keep people from looking into the problems of the Indian to see if there is a solution. This leaves their activities untouched, as special interest groups continue to terminate, embezzle, and exterminate the American Indian. Today, there are many sophisticated methods of termination. One is community action programs, which tries to get industry on reservations. This industry's programs builds their factories, owning them 100%, and have no profit sharing with the tribe. They do it tax-free and without the control of the federal government. All it has to do is to get the Indian to surrender his occupancy rights, hire a few Indians, and pay about 1/3 the wages paid to other minorities. Or they build housing projects. Houses. I mean, his dirt hut is better than these houses. Now keep this in mind. The yearly income of the Indian is about $1,500 per year, while the house payments run about $75 to $100 per month. You can plainly see that there is no money left for other expenses, and when this Indian misses a payment, foreclosure takes place, not only on his house, but the land too. Next time, some of these attorneys, or better yet, great authorities on the Indian problems, state that the Indian should assimilate, terminate his lands, and move to the cities because he is not learning how to run his own affairs. Tell him to tell you about guardianship alienation or what termination really means. Now look, if a little dumb Sioux boy from the plains of South Dakota can come up with some answers and still not be legal counsel, then those that control the American Indian lands must have a lot more answers than I do. Either they live in fear, or the American bar has told them to join in with the extermination of the Indian. Go all the way. You know, I can just hear some of the comments. What's wrong with this Indian? He's cutting off people from helping his Indians. Don't believe it. I may be crazy, but never could I be a stupid Indian. The journey into cities meeting your leaders has been made, and they have committed themselves not to help the Indians' problems. They are concerned because if you, their subjects, read this book written from this viewpoint, some action may take place. And after all, 175,000 authors on this subject have never moved anyone. This game should not change at this point in history. Mankind is still not ready to think this deep. So all of a sudden, I'm to lose my mind and believe that people will move to correct some of their wrongdoings. Now who's stupid? I even laugh myself sick when I hear the latest phrases that have been stamped into their minds as they run to the young urban Indian. Get into the framework of the society. That's a good laugh, because the Mexican American has been in the framework of the white man's society more years than the United States has been a nation or country. He's no further ahead than the Indian coming off the reservation. Let Indians control their own lives. Let Indians make their own decisions so they can appoint Indians to positions in the Bureau of Indian Affairs. But in the meantime, what little jurisdiction that was left in the Bureau was transferred to other government agencies. So we have Indians speaking for Indians, but with no power. Let us, as Indians, unite. So across the country, thousands of Indian nonprofit organizations are springing up, each trying to rip off money from OEO. They are organizations that have no jurisdiction on the Indian problems, but still they speak in place of the Indian on the reservation. Sometimes to be an Indian activist trying to help the reservations and their problems, you have to be an Einstein, a Davy Crockett, George Custer, Abe Lincoln, or the biggest crook of them all, George Washington, just to get the problems of the Indian herd. The most recent pale-faced trick is to get urban Indians in the cities to form organizations where a project of culture or studies in ethnology can use vacant land which still belongs to the reservation Indians holding sovereignty rights. These projects being funded by OEO will one day stop funding and will leave these urban Indians, but the title to this land will remain with OEO. So the reservation Indian who can prove these acts are illegal cannot be heard, because OEO has given the voice to urban Indians who have a legal right to them, but having no knowledge of this, sign occupancy land rights away, termination at its final legal working. It can even pass international law. The urban Indian of today has joined forces with the white man against the reservation Indian to fully terminate him. If everybody is hell and all bent to terminate the American Indian, then let me ask a simple question. If all the Indians were killed off in the United States, would it continue to be a blessed nation? I say no, because in Mexico and South America, where the resources are in more of abundance than in the United States, there is offered no great wealth or promise of success, because the ideology is that of the European. The Spaniard made the mistake of creating a race of half-breeds by also getting rid of the frame of mind of the Indian, something the United States watched out for. It copied his government, towns, religions, foods, medicine, and defensive methods and became the greatest. So even if we are oppressed, the area that we walk is blessed because of our frame of mind. No matter where in the world we could be, any land or nation would be the most blessed. If you don't believe it, kill all Indians and see if your God will hold you up.